Well, welcome, welcome. Can hopefully everyone can see the first slide there. All right, and you are the first one to pick up on the zombie apocalypse use of my book, so I appreciate that someone out there was thinking ahead. Um, Thank you all very much, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And I love the fact that this is sort of part of a brown bag seminar because when I think about brown bags, what I think about is, it can be a little bit more intimate. It can be a little bit more formative. We can talk about some ideas that are sort of under development as opposed to figuring out we have to go and impress everyone with what big words we can use. So, with that, what I'd like to talk about is some sort of new thinking that I've been working on around the concepts of sharing and lending, and back again, talking about what that is. New librarianship is a phrase that came out of the book, The Atlas of New Librarianship, but if you read the book, you'll find that it quickly says that, this is just librarianship, that what we're looking at is a profession that needs to, on a regular basis, think about itself. I mean, some people put that in the negative. I think I saw a tweet the other day that perhaps with the exception of journalists, librarians are the most obsessed with their own doom. But I'd like to think of it as we're in the idea business and we're constantly having to think and encounter with ideas, new medium, new consequences. And so that means we always think about what our role is. And so new librarianship is an attempt to think about what are we now? What do we do now? How do we move forward, particularly in times of great change? But it's not new librarianship in the sense that everything we used to do is crap, let's start over again. I don't know if any of you lived through the whole Library 2.0 world, but there was a lot of venom in that. It was a lot of, well, catalogs, that's from 1990s. We don't do those anymore. Or everything is going to be, we don't catalog anymore. We don't do this. It's all blogging and such. And that's just not what this is intended to be. It's really intended for us to think about readjusting and constantly readjusting our relationships with the communities that we seek to serve. Because frankly, I think we're dealing with that now, and we probably got a little bit off to the side of dealing with the materials and not so much the community. And so this is an attempt to talk about recentering within that. And so a lot of the discussions around librarianship and how it's evolving go around ideas like what is that relationship to community? How do we foster conversations? How do people learn? But I want to talk about a really specific thing, which is I want to talk about how we run libraries. I think the mission of librarians and the mission of libraries are not always the same thing. And there's a great power in both the profession and the institutions, but they're not always a one-to-one match. And I want to talk a little bit about where I see the power of the institution going for a moment. So that's my big introduction, but let's just jump into it. And once again, as questions come up, feel free to chat, and Lindsay or anyone else can interrupt as I go. And I'm going to start with Ben, because it's always appropriate to start with Ben. Many people talk about Benjamin Franklin as someone who started the first public library in the New World, in America, and it's not true. Benjamin Franklin started one of the first libraries in the United States, but he started something called he started something called a subscription library. When he was in Philadelphia, he got together with a bunch of other readers and people who had way too many books for their own homes, got tired of worried about having to travel from house to house to find the book you wanted. And so they said, hey, let's rent a common facility, let's put our materials in there, and let's share what we've got. And then they charged a fee to be part of that so that they could support the institution, they could support the facility, that kind of thing. Now, what's interesting about this notion of Benjamin Franklin and the first public library in, say, Philadelphia, is that, once again, it wasn't. But it's very different in that it was something based on sharing. It was a bunch of people who got together and said we were going to share our resources. Now, the first public library in Philadelphia, in the city of Philadelphia, was actually the Free Library of Philadelphia, which is still going on today, founded by a fellow by the name of, and I'm not making this up, Dr. Pepper, who had a rich uncle, Dr. Pepper, and they both worked at the University of Pennsylvania. And they raised a lot of money, and they created a free and open public library to benefit the citizens of Philadelphia. And they had a very different philosophy, where sharing was primarily what Benjamin Franklin's was, and frankly within that, sharing amongst those who could afford to share, who had something to share. The Free Library Philadelphia was very much community service. It was intended as a place to give to all the citizens, no matter their needs, no matter their means. And so it was free. That was the emphasis. The Free Library Philadelphia, as it was formed and as it exists today, however, was a lending institution, whereas Franklin's was a sharing institution. And so you're saying, Dave, I don't care. They sound the same to me. Aren't these just synonyms? Well, let me work some terms in for a moment. Sharing, and what I mean by sharing, is combining resources together to create a richer commons. In essence, what we're seeing is we're putting stuff together. Anyone who joins brings stuff with them. Lending is allowing people to borrow from a common resource. So we build a collection and let people borrow out of it. So you can think about, if you think about, say, public libraries today, or you think even about academic libraries, you think about special libraries, the idea is that someone, a member, I don't like the word patron and I hate the word user, we'll get to that in a while, a member comes in the library and says, I'd like that book, and so they borrow it, and then they bring it back. Whereas a sharing library means if you want to be part of this, you've got to ante up something to be part of this. In Franklin's case, it was resources and some money. So they're not exactly the same. The consequence of that is that what you end up with is that the more you share, the more you have, but the more you lend, the less you have. And that might sound really abstract, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump right into what that means in the way my tiny mind can understand it, which is talking about macroeconomics and planning a dinner party. So one of my favorite phrases ever, one of my, Joan Fry Williams, brilliant librarian and library consultant, said, we need to start thinking of libraries not as grocery stores, but as kitchens. Not as someplace you go in and you put everything in your cart and you go away to do the work of making food, making meals. We need to think of that as the social place in which people are creating, and you're joining in and you're working on it. And so it's a really cool idea. So I'm going to take that metaphor and completely abuse it and talk about what we're going to make with all that food that we brought in. And I want to say, all right, so we're going to have a dinner party. And you got two choices. So the choice here on the left is you're going to invite your people, you're going to buy the food, you're going to prepare the food for them, they're all going to come at an appointed hour, they'll all sit around the table, you'll serve your food out. And if someone else shows up to that dinner party, you better hope that you bought a little extra food. And if too many people show up at that dinner party, you need to go out and buy some more food or they're going to go hungry. You can't really plan around this sort of really flexible sense because you have a limited set of resources and you're the only one who's bringing resources to it. You're the only one bringing the food. Now compare that to what's going on the right side, which is the potluck, right? Everyone who wants to come on Thursday night for a party, just bring a plate with you. Bring, God only knows what people bring, but bring, meatballs and bring spaghetti and bring queso dip and bring all this other stuff. And so now the more people who show up at the dinner party, the more food you have to share. Except, of course, someone is always going to bring that thing that no one else wants, but we'll get there later. So really now the resources that you're laying out for the potluck dinner parties, you need a space and you need, enough tables to hold it. You probably seed it with some materials, some food everyone wants or some soda, things like that. But the idea here is that if you think of a lending model, that's the dinner party where you're preparing the food. And so the more people who show up to the party, the less food there is to go around. And then a potluck is a sharing model. The more people show up, the more resources they bring, the more there is to share. Now, this isn't exactly a precise way of thinking about it, and we'll get into its limitations. But I just want you to think about that for a moment as I dive into sort of how we put that in macroeconomic terms. And I don't pretend to be an economist, nor do I play one on TV, but I love reading about it. And this is called the network effect. So the network effect is a idea, a concept that certain networks, certain products, certain items, certain services become more valuable the more people that use them. And the classic example is a telephone. And for those of you not old enough, that's why we call it dialing a phone, because it has a dial on there. And I just like the old retro feel to it. The telephone network. The first telephone in the world was a very, very sad piece of technology, right? The first fax machine, sometimes people use fax machines, was a very useless item. They cost a lot. You hooked them up to a network, and if no one else had a phone or a fax, it had zero value. So even though you may have spent a certain amount of money for that first device, you had, in effect, very little value out of it. The second telephone, or the second fax machine, let's stick with the telephone, the second telephone increased the value of your telephone enormously. Without giving you money or whatever, suddenly you had someone else to call. And everyone who then added a phone line on top of that and on top of that and on top of that added more and more and more and more and more value to the network without you having to invest any additional money. Right? So you just had to sit in, and as some people took their telephone and added a telephone and added a telephone, your resource became more valuable, and yet you weren't out more resources. You didn't have to go buy everyone else a telephone, for example. And so the more that people came in, the more value is in the network, the bigger the effect. That's the potluck, right? The more people who are willing to play this game, the more they're willing to add their resources in, the greater the value of your investment becomes. Now we see this network effect all over the place, right? So yeah, the dial phone may seem antiquated, but think about social networks, right? So when Google Plus first came out, and Google Plus said, hey, we're like Facebook, but we have circles and we're round and there's a plus after it and all this other stuff, suddenly everyone in the world signed up for a Google Plus account. I have one. I haven't used it ever, but I have one. And so the idea is everyone said, oh no, everyone's going to be in Google Plus land. But what happened was people didn't get rid of their Facebook account at the same time. And so what happened is Facebook didn't actually lose much value by Google Plus gaining it. And as people began to say, I do or don't adopt Google Plus, they sort of went back to their existing networks. And you could see the effect of the opposite happening with, say, MySpace. When MySpace was the cool, hep place to be, the more people joining MySpace, the more value you had, the more interesting it was getting. And then something happened with Facebook. People started leaving MySpace. Not only did they join Facebook, but they left MySpace at the same time. And so the opposite effect happened, which is as fewer and fewer people used MySpace, the value of MySpace went down and down and down. As more and more people used Facebook, it went up and up and up. Now, there's lots of other complex things going on here, like how do you keep people using something? How do you keep that value evident? How do you make sure that it doesn't overwhelm them? We'll get that in a second. But I just want you to get a sense that these network effects are going on all the time. Professional associations, like TLA and such, are another example of the network effect. If there was one librarian that was part of the professional association, it would be a lonely, lonely place. But the more people that you can join in, the more people you can get to come to a conference, the more people you can get to discuss things on a webinar, etc., the more value comes into play. Consortia is a direct network effect instrument. The more of us in a buying arrangement, the more of us in a resource sharing environment, the better. Mark records. OCLC is the network effect. The more organizations that are willing to contribute their cataloging records to the central store that we all share, the more valuable the central store becomes, the more benefit we get for the resources that we put in. So far, so good? Sorry if I'm nailing this head way too far. There is an opposite effect. There is a sort of counterbalance, counterforce, and it's called congestion. And what it means is if you are getting this network effect where more and more people are joining a network, you're getting benefit, there does become a point where any of the resources that network's using, any of the stuff, the money, the people, the time, the attention, the effort that's using that's finite, will limit how far that goes. And so the classic example is, while the wired telephone became more and more and more valuable as more and more people joined, if you've ever tried to use an iPhone or any smartphone in the middle of Manhattan or a large city, you know the opposite is true as well, because you're dealing with limited bandwidth, you're dealing with limited airspace, frequencies. That is, the first iPhone that was used on this network was brilliant and wonderful, and you could get to the net. The second and third, you could do cool iPhone things. The 3 millionth, the 4 millionth, suddenly everyone was competing for the same AT&T bandwidth and then the same, Verizon bandwidth and such. And pretty soon, bandwidth became so limited that you got a traffic jam. And so now, the next person who adds in, it becomes harder and harder to use. We see congestion effects at the local level a lot more than we see network effects. For example, holds in Harry Potter, or I guess these days it would be 50 Shades of Grey, or whatever you want. Though Lindsay's a children's librarian, so we hope it's not 50 Shades of Grey. But here's an example where if you have a limited resource, in this case a book or material, the more people who want it, the longer they have to wait. Because we're in this lending model. We're not actually in a sharing model, which I'll talk about in a second. Bandwidth. If you have a cable modem at home and you're the first one on your street to get it, it's fast and brilliant. You're the last one, try watching Netflix on Friday night when everyone else is trying to watch Netflix. That's a resource that gets used up very quickly. Instruction. For many of us that offer instruction at our universities or colleges or schools or public libraries, we know that hot topics, we fill up spaces. So the finite resource of the physical facility can mean that we put people on waiting lists or we offer multiple sections, and do we have enough time to offer multiple sections? And you get the point. So there's always this tension between the network effect, which is more people better, and congestion, which is more use of a limited resource, the worse. So let me now try and make this really specific. Let's take Harry Potter or 50 Shades of Grey or a book of your choice. I'm going to talk about the lending model. So the lending model, which is the predominant model in public and academic and school libraries around the world, which is that we as an institution, we as a library, build a collection. So we go out and we buy it, we build it, we own it, we maintain it, and then we lend it out to people who want it. All right? So we have this book. When we have a relatively few number of members, patrons, users, whatever you want to call it, people coming in to get that resource, it works out really well. And we do our best to, I'm sorry, I just saw, is anyone else getting audio distortion? Am I talking too loud? Should I turn down my volume? Okay. All right. Thank you all very much. I appreciate for the feedback. So where was I? All right. So if you have if you're sitting there and you're the Nashville Public Library and you have 2 people a day that come in to use your resources, that would be very bad. But for those 2 people, it would be really great because they wouldn't have to wait for anything. They'd have access to it. But we know that as we do a good job, we get more and more people showing up, and the more and more people trying to get this limited resource, i.e. the collection that we own, the worse service they get. Right? So now instead of having to wait 0 days for a record, they might have to wait 10, 20, 30 days for it. I'm currently a sort of convert over to Blu-ray discs, and one of our local libraries carries Blu-ray discs, and it was absolutely fabulous the first day, but now as more and more people get it, I'm on really long hold lists for anything I'd actually want to watch. So we know this effect. But as libraries, we've known this for a long time. And we know we have this sort of network effect in our head going, hey, I know how to solve this problem. We will work through consortia. We'll network. We'll network across branches. We'll network across systems. We'll network across types of libraries. We'll, in essence, expand our capability by being able to use the resources of multiple locations. Right? So this is the drive to create library consortia. We've seen this for a long time. The problem with this, of course, is that it assumes that there is slack in the system. It assumes that each of these libraries that join the consortia brings some sort of underutilization of the resource we want. But we know that they're sitting there with a bunch of people trying to get their resources as well. And now that we're sharing them, in some cases we're actually seeing access to our resources go down. Right? I'm sorry, lending them. Right? So what happens is we've taken a finite resource, we've tried our best to come up with a network scale, but really what we're doing is we're adding our limitations to other people's limitations, and that can cause some stress. So that's a lending model. The problem with the lending model is we have a finite resource, being the collections of resources, by the way, time on reference desk, instruction that we can deliver, brilliance of our librarians, you pick it. We have a limited resource there. And as people borrow it, they take it out of the pool, and that means more people have to wait till it goes back in the pool. More demand equals more wait, more use equals fewer resources. Right? So it's a lot of what we try and do within libraries. We're finding this sort of peak usage knocks us out. Now that's a lending model. Let me talk then about a sharing model and why that's a different model. A sharing model says, all right, this is sort of a sharing model, except it's institution sharing. But the truth is that those people sitting there trying to access our resources, trying to get at our resources, also have resources themselves. And so what if we, I don't know, went to them and said, hey, can we use your stuff? And so now suddenly any member who joins our library, who comes and utilizes our service, if we look at them not as someone who's simply going to borrow and walk away, but we look at someone who's going to borrow but also contribute back, it becomes a very different equation. We move from lending to sharing. So Eli Nyberger, who's at the Ann Arbor District Library, tells the story of how he had one of his members come in and say, so you know how I can use the catalog to look for a book? And Eli says, yes, we worked hard on that. I'm glad you could do that. He goes, and you know how when I look at the book, I can also see if there's a book in one of the branches? Yep, got that. This member said, well, I've got books at home that I'm willing to share too. Right? If you can catalog books here and you can catalog books in the branches, can't you also add the entry for information in my house? And then if someone wants one of the things I've got, I'm perfectly willing to bring it in the next day and share it. Now, in a lending model, in this model where the library owns the collection, where it's our stuff and we're providing a service out to the community, that makes no sense. What in the world? That's crazy. Why would we do that? Think of all the time and effort we'd have to catalog it. And who knows if you're going to go on vacation, and I can't be responsible for your materials, and your materials haven't been shrink wrapped and all this other stuff. But if you think of a sharing model, which is that the resources of the community, some housed in a library, some housed in people's homes, some housed in town hall, some housed in little free libraries sitting on the corner, then it suddenly makes a lot of sense. And you start going, yeah, why not? And in fact, we can share lots of materials. If you want a copy of 50 Shades of Grey, or you want a copy of Harry Potter, or if you're in a university setting and I'm in a school of library science, you want a copy of Rubin's book, or you want a copy of Taylor's book, or Arlene Taylor's, whatever it is, we've got a bunch of them lying around. We can share them amongst ourselves. So we can begin to talk about, not only can I borrow from this commons, I can contribute to the commons. And that gets pretty interesting. And so we can take this sort of one step further, which is we've been talking books all along. But the truth is that these individuals have more than just books lying around. They have pictures, and they have maps and guides and their own creative work and their own ideas and their own expertise. Right? They have, I just built, not that you need to know my business, but I just built dog steps. We managed to have one of those Posturepedic beds. They're like huge. It's like sleeping on a foam marshmallow that's stale, but it's really high up, and we got a little dog. And so we used to have to pick him up all the time, and it was very annoying. And so I had to build steps. I'm not the handiest guy in the world. And so being able to quickly go online or talk to my friend who's a carpenter, or talk to someone else who can walk me through the process of cut here and cut here and cut here, suddenly I can take advantage of the network of expertise I have around us. We talk about going to the library, either virtually or in person, where we can talk to this brilliant librarian. And that's fabulous. But I also want to be able to go to the library and talk to the brilliant carpenter, the brilliant faculty member, the brilliant kid, the brilliant teacher, the brilliant whatever it is. That kind of sharing of a network really changes the equation, right? So now we're to the point where we're in a sharing model. And the sharing model changes the notion of what the library is. The library in a lending model, the library sort of as we've institutionalized it all too often, is a place that serves the community, that has its own set of resources, librarians, collections, internet connectivity, terminals, and people come and use us. We know we're a finite resource, so that we know that if we get too much usage, particularly if we get too much usage and then a nice cut into our budget, then we get overwhelmed, and we know that we can actually end up serving people poorly. Right? The dilemma that we're in is that many of the ways, if we set up on this lending model of libraries, the more successful we are, the worse service we provide. Right? That's where we're really frightened. Right? The more we entice people into reading, the more they're going to read, the more time they're going to check out books, the fewer books we're going to have to check out to the world. We need to break that cycle. And I would say that we fundamentally need to break that cycle for lots of reasons, but this is the economic reason we need to break that cycle. So in this sharing model, where we look at every point on this graph as a potential resource that can be shared, that can be utilized, that can be brought forward, the library shifts from an institution beside the community, an institution that has its own resources that are finite and limited, to a platform. So the library becomes a platform for that community. Once again, I use the word community very broadly. I use the word community to mean a community of scholars and students in a higher education setting, a community of principals and teachers and students in a K-12 setting, a community of people living in Nashville, a community of interesting quilters who come together on Thursday, right? So think about these different communities that we serve. So in this notion where the library becomes a platform to allow sharing of not only the stuff and expertise controlled directly by the library, but the stuff and resources provided out and thought through by the entire community, sure, a person can still come in and pick a book or get a resource. There are always going to be resources that are way beyond the capability of any individual to deal with, where we accumulate money, tax, tuition, what have you, to buy it. Large databases, million-dollar commercial databases, the idea of the periodical resources, certain books that we know we're going to need on a regular basis, these kinds of things. It still makes sense as a community for us to say, look, I'm not going to buy it and you're not going to buy it, but let's all come together and rent it, lease it, borrow it, think about it. All right? So that's still going to happen. But increasingly, people are going to say, well, why can't I just go through this platform to get to this material or this resource, or more interestingly for me, to get to this person, where I can use the library as a way of connecting me to other individuals. So one of the stories that I hear often, well, that I heard, but is a regular story, is we have someone in our community who's an expert on X. So in this case, in North Onondaga, this whole lecture, by the way, is inspired by a fabulous librarian named Meg Bacchus. And she works at the North Onondaga Public Library, and she is in charge of adult services, which, if there is a name that is less appropriate to what people expect, I don't know what it is. But what she did was she found this guy who was a Civil War buff. I mean, studied it, cared about it, loved it, talked about it, read about it, really made himself into an expert on it. But he worked in a warehouse. And what she said is, he sort of talking with Meg and said, you know, I could come on, say, Thursday afternoons and do a little talk about the Civil War. And she said, that's great. We can provide you the facility, the place, we'll publicize it, we'll get people coming in. And what she found is on that Thursday, and then the Thursday after that, and the Thursday after that, is people showed up who were also self-taught experts, people just curious, and they formed another community, and the library brought them together. The library provided this individual, this guy who worked in a warehouse, an outlet for his passion. The library provided a forum to educate their populace. It provided a way of building community. It provided a way of helping that community learn about something they felt was important. And the library made it happen as a platform. Not as, we'll write a book and we'll buy it. Not as, well, we'll put out some interesting reading about it. Not as, we'll find some good resources for it if people ask. But in networking, in providing this community coming together. So let me give you a few other examples of thinking about the library as a platform. And once again, linking that what I mean by platform is a way of sharing, the community sharing its own resources and own expertise. So one of them is we worked with a company called Polaris Library Systems. So they make integrated library systems. And we started talking about how could we incorporate more community information into integrated library systems. And we came up with this idea called a community profile. And the idea is that, let's say that, you know, I'm in Onondaga County in upstate New York, and we have lots of organizations, from the Red Cross to literacy organizations to arts organizations to all these different organizations. And so what we begin to do is we begin to connect that information in. Librarians can go in and say, oh, here's Red Cross's information. So I'm going to add where they are, what they do, and if they have events coming up, and blood drives and education sessions and first aid sessions and etc. And now when a library member comes in and searches for information on blood or searches for information on health, up comes not only books and materials, But organizations, here's the organizations you may be interested in. By the way, as a side, we always thought it would be brilliant to link them to anyone who searched for vampires, but that was just an internal joke. We then said, well, we could take this a one step further, because what we're sort of doing is mark cataloging people. Ugh. What if we said that not only that, but we could have the organizations enter their own information into our integrated library system? In other words, they have a much greater time capacity and commitment and consequence to keep their information up to date. So let's approve the people and let them add their own data in. So now the American Red Cross can add their own resources, and keep that up to date, keep those resources going, if the library chooses. And then we said, well, what do we do with like these small community organizations? So one of my favorite in around here is a group called Lukey Souls Foundation. And Lukey was a brilliant, wide-eyed, smart, wonderful child who died of leukemia young. And his parents created a foundation, and that foundation had an annual golfing event. Once a year, big golfing event. They would raise money and they would give it to the Children's Hospital. They couldn't afford to do, I did posters for them because they couldn't afford to hire an artist. They certainly couldn't afford to have a hosted web server. And they had full-time jobs and other children, so they really didn't have the way of creating this web presence to point people to and put photos up afterwards of the event, things like that. Well, what if they created one of these profiles, and not only could you find their profile if you were searching for children's charity or golfing within the catalog, but we could create from their profile a landing page, a page with their own URL, and so they could have a web presence. And by entering that data into the catalog, not only does it become available for people searching through the library, but it creates a web presence for them they never had before. So now the library as a platform is providing web presence for the community itself. But then we dealt with organizations like the Boys and Girls Clubs, and they said, well, we have a website. Thank you. We spent a lot of time on it, but what would be great is when people come to our website in the Boys and Girls Club, if they could also find information on health and parenting and mentoring and activities and all these other things. And so the community profile allows you to embed information from the library in your own website, your own web presence. And then we went one step further, which is we had a student, Kesuke Inoue, brilliant doctoral student here at Syracuse, say, I'm building an iPad app. And what I want to do is when you get on the buses going through Syracuse, I'm going to have built-in iPad where you can say, I'm about to get off on this stop. What's around me? And what that iPad app will do is it will go and talk to the library, find your location, then search through all these community profiles and tell you here library events, here's the American Red Cross is doing a blood drive, Lukey Soul's doing a golf, whatever's near me. And so what we have in that situation is we have someone creating an interface and a service built on top of the library where the library wasn't responsible in charge of building that resource. And they're getting information for this service, for this iPad, from the community organizations that, once again, the library didn't have to enter. But none of this would have worked without the library being there. So when we talk about a library's platform, when we talk about a sharing world, what we're talking about is taking something we know how to do really well within the library community, integrated library systems. I mean, come on, if there's something more fundamental and fuddy-duddy and less, sort of into the future Buzz Lightyear about it, integrated library systems might be it. But now looking at the integrated library system as a integrated community platform and information sharing world with not a lot of work, suddenly life gets different. The information coming into the system isn't owned by us. The information going out of the system isn't owned by us. And yet we are doing our important, essential job within our communities, which is providing them information service, helping them learn, helping them improve. Let me give you another non-techie example. I'll choose Meg again. So Meg's sitting up at North Onondaga Public Library. A lot of patrons come in, a lot of members come in, and they start talking about, we want to do gardening, but I don't have the space, I don't have the time, I don't know what I'm doing. And so what they did is the library, for the cost of an outdoor hose, took part of their real estate, part of their physical plot, their yard, staked them off and brought a bunch of interested people in so that you could loan out books on gardening and a plot. And you could go out and garden, and they would have regular sessions on it. And then at the end of the year, when they ended up with too much food for any individual, they started learning about, well, what about sustainable agriculture? And what can we do with locally produced materials? And it began a whole sort of education process. And so the library here was a physical platform. It was providing physical space for something to happen, and yet they were still fulfilling their mission. They talked at one point about putting white walking trails behind the library so that when you went and searched fitness, it could say, here's a book on fitness, and the other one would be turn around and walk left. You can check out a trail for the day. And so this idea that the library isn't necessarily, we're sharing. We're providing a platform where people are sharing their knowledge, their time, their expertise, their wisdom, their events. And the more people who come in, the more they share, the more valuable the library becomes. And at the same time, we're not having to extend what limited resources we have, right? It wasn't a matter where we said, all right, the librarians are going to garden, right? We didn't say the community is welcome to come in and watch us garden and then have the reference staff sit there and go, now I've got a garden, right? That's not what happened. What they said is let them garden and we'll do our job in helping and facilitating and learning. And with the community portals, instead of saying, well, you mean now I've got to enter every event from every community organization? The answer was no, let the community do it. And as they do it, more people will come to the library to use that resource, and we'll become more understood, better integrated within the community. And so when we turn around and say, would you like to continue having Lukey's Soul Foundation have a web presence and make a contribution to the Children's Hospital, or would you like to cut the library budget? It becomes a very different conversation than simply saying, we're librarians, and when people walk in our buildings, we do good stuff. I want to give you two other examples. This is a group of folks from the I Lead You. Lindsay mentioned it. She was there from one of the state libraries. I'm not sure if you're in there, Lindsay, or if this was the year before. Yeah, you're in there somewhere, I think. Anyway, this is a program that was put together by the State Library of Illinois. It's a fabulous program. Ann Craig, who's in the lower left-hand corner, is the state librarian, and she said the most important thing for a state library is to prepare librarians. And so she put her money where her mouth is. She got an IMLS grant, and they said, we're going to have 3 intensive sessions where people are going to come for 3 days at a time, 3 times throughout a year. They're going to form teams that are going to span libraries and library types, and they're going to work on a cool technology project. And so what we can do is they worked on some cool projects. And I'm just going to talk about 2 of them. This one, Transform U, was a set of libraries around O'Hare, which is in the northern part of the state, O'Hare, outside of Chicago. And what they did is they said, we have a problem. This will sound completely unfamiliar to anyone. We have a lot of folks seeking employment. And a lot of times when libraries talk about how they serve the unemployed and people seeking to be unemployed, they talk about things like, we find job searching databases. We run sessions on writing a resume. We are a place where people can work and do job searching and get connected to online applications. And that's very important work. But what this group said is when we actually talked to the folks looking for jobs, what we found out was that oftentimes this is an opportunity, a moment in time for them to think about totally changing their lives. Maybe it's not the same kind of job they had before. Maybe it's a totally different career. Maybe it's staying at home and figuring out how to budget appropriately. Maybe it's they need social assistance before they can find that job. Maybe it's going back to college and going back to school. And so what they did was they said, let's identify the network of possibilities that people coming into our libraries can do, and let's form really strong partnerships. So they went to the county social service agencies and said, give us some cross-training or resources and put some people in our libraries. And so when people come in, we can not just say, let me look up online, but I can say, talk to Betty, and here's this service. And when they looked at, say, the local community college, they found that a lot of people, when they apply to go back to school with community colleges, are overwhelmed by what's a bursar, what's a registrar, what's this form. And so they worked to not only simplify the forms, but they once again had a direct chain where they could say, if you're interested in this, we're going to host, our community college is coming in, they're hosting an awareness session next Thursday night, be here for that, and then we will personally introduce you to the people in the admissions office who will help you work on it. And so they created these Transform U kits where they would walk them through counseling, and they would provide them with training and tools on not only interviewing, but going back to school and staying at home and all these different career options. And this is another example. This is Eureka Public Library, once again in rural Illinois. And what they did is they were, busy working on being a nice rural library. And the lady on the left there, Katie the cook, came in and said there aren't enough places for lunch to eat lunch in Eureka. and I'm a certified commercial chef, and I'd like to figure out how to start a place. And the librarian, sitting on the right, said, I got a great idea. See that corner of our property? You could set up there. She had a commercial kitchen that she already had access to. She would prepare the food. She would come in, she would set up, and they would do lunch right there. I think it started like every Tuesday and then pretty much moved to every day. And now she has her own place, a catering business. And so when someone said, I'm interested in helping the community and helping myself start a business, their answer wasn't, what's from our limited resources can we provide you? It was, we're a platform. Here's a place. Here's a connection. Here are people to do it. Here's publicity. And the check you see going across is actually they won an award from the state for entrepreneurship, for rural economic development, won an award for doing this. Because instead of just talking about finding a job, they talked about how to have people change their lives. They were sharing their resources and adding resources, right? The chef brought to them people looking for lunch that then might stay and use other resources within the library. The library was helping the community in something that the library wasn't prepared to do. The librarians didn't say, we're really great chefs, let's solve this problem. But they did say, here's an opportunity, we can help this person share their gift, their talents, their resources with the rest of the community. So what are some implications? Let me just run through briefly some more implications from this, and then I will shut up and hopefully we can have a conversation. Implications. If you're in an academic setting, you probably already jumped to the fact that this has a massive effect around scholarly publishing. Right? What we have in scholarly publishing is that our institutions, universities and such, give away our effort, our academic books and journal articles and whatever, and then we're forced for the library to buy it back. Right? We all know that this is a broken cycle. We all sort of fixate on the cost of it, whereas the faculty are fixated on what they get out of it, which is prestige, which has nothing to do with money. But if we really spent some time thinking about this, we could look at it as we have a lending problem. We buy a limited resource in the form of these licenses, and we then have to give quotas out and ration the service out to our community. Whereas if we just got it directly from our academics, we could do what we want as an organization, not as a library, but as the whole university. So that's why when you look at the notion of institutional repositories, we'll take all these papers and we'll put them in a big DSpace, Content DM, database, ePrints, whatever. It doesn't work, because we haven't really built a network effect, or the network effect we want to build is very small, right? If all we do is provide the world access to just our little stuff, our universities, it's not enough. But if we networked our repositories at our university with another university, with another university, with Harvard, with MIT, with Stanford, with Syracuse, with all these other University of Tennessee, etc., then suddenly the more resources that go into that, the more articles that are published, the more people seeking it, the better the system becomes. We move out of the congestion model, we move out of the lending model, we move out of the finite resource, and we move into the network effect. The role of librarians then begins to shift from acquisitions, how do we buy stuff, to curation, how do we make access easy, available, and findable for the stuff that's coming in being shared by the world. Because when we built these consortia, on one hand, when we were sharing resources through the consortia, it was network effect, but many consortia now have become buying agents. So what they're doing is pulling limited numbers of money, because it's coming from limited resources in tuition or tax dollars, and we're getting some network effect, but nowhere near the possibility of if we bypassed the people we're buying from and went right back to the community and shared those resources directly. Right? So this whole notion of user-generated content or hosting material of the community, or libraries becoming more about creation than about finding limited resources, is not just some nice hippie Web 2.0 radical blah, blah, blah. It's a viable economic model, and we're in a limited model. I don't know about you, but if your library is dealing with ebooks at all, the problem with the ebook model is we have people creating artificial scarcity, right? Adding friction to the process. You can only circulate this digital item 26 times before it self-destructs, Mr. Phelps, right? We're dealing with that, and we're dealing with a finite resource on the other end, which is our money that we can spend to it, and we're going to drive ourselves broke. Not only are we going to drive ourselves broke by trying to chase the demand for ebooks in the current model, we're going to piss poorly serve people at the same time. We're going to run them through systems that take, PhDs in rocket science to figure out how to download something to a Kindle, and at the same time spend an enormous amount of money creating a limited resource that's going to up demand while we're unable to meet the demand and drive us bankrupt at the same time. This doesn't make much sense. Going directly to authors and saying, hey, would you like to share directly, and we'll build a system like Amazon is doing. I mean, this is how Amazon is eating the lunch of publishers. They went right to the authors and said, we will take less money out of it. Instead of them taking 70%, we'll take 30%, you'll take 70%, and we'll give you all these other benefits to it, and they get a network effect as more authors go there. Why can't libraries do that? Collection development becomes connection development. Rather than worrying about what we have and what we're building, we can start talking about who we're talking to and who they can talk to. Who are the brilliant people within our communities that we can let shine, that we can make available to people. Rather than talking about bringing the world to our community, that's an old model, right? When you go to the library, you learn about everything that's not your community. Now we talk about unleashing our communities on the rest of the world. How can we make the Nashville perspective available to people in Vermont? When I'm going to come visit down to Chattanooga, can I go to the Chattanooga Library and see what the life is like in Chattanooga? Or do I walk in and find out what life is like everywhere else but Chattanooga? Size doesn't matter. Rural libraries are actually very well positioned in this, right? Some of those really cool techniques that you're seeing about community gardening, Katie, the cook, all these things are actually rural libraries, and rural libraries tend to be very well integrated within their communities. And so I'm not saying throw away the books and we're not about books anymore. What I'm saying is when people come in and look for those resources, find out what they can bring in with them and what they're willing to share. So my big conclusion, and then like I say, I hope we can have some conversations, is that the future is bright for both librarians and libraries. Librarians are finding more and more roles outside of libraries. They're being recruited into academia, they're being recruited into business and industry, and they're working within libraries. But the institutions of libraries have great value. When we look at our collections, when we look at what a 300-year history or 200-year or 100-year history is, when we look at the physical footprint within our communities, all of this is still a bright future. It makes sense to have physical libraries, but it makes sense to have physical libraries that are hubs that are sharing, not simply places with a primarily print collection, which we question how necessary it will be. You go, do you like your community? Yes, that's what we need libraries for. The real debate about the future of libraries is not actually about the library. The real debate about the future of libraries is the debate about what we mean by public, what we mean by a community. Is a community just a place where we grab and share? Right? Libraries are places of aspiration, innovation, and creation. That's our heritage and our future. Right? We need to get out of this mindset that we're just consumers, that we're really good, smart consumers that buy from the right jobbers, that we're really good, smart consumers that we buy the right integrated library system, that we're really good consumers and we know how to, save every dime, and we prepare our members to be really good consumers as well, so they come in and we make it as frictionless as possible. You know what we need to do? Our libraries often are more valuable when they stop a process from happening than when we can make a process happen easier. Right? There are lots of organizations that are about consuming information. They will eat our lunch if we want to be in that, because their whole world is about manipulating people into buying things easily and with a higher margin. That should not be our goal. Our goal should be having people think about what they're about to purchase, think about its value, and think about how to do it in the most effective way possible. Thinking does not necessarily equal really easy. We need to help people think and consider and deliberate. And that's a unique business that we're in. And it's not a consumer business. It's not a customer business. It's not a user business. It's a member business. It's a neighbor business. It's a faculty business. So what I want you to think about is as we move from loaning stuff out to sharing, is what we're really talking about is unlocking libraries from a service that people consume to a platform that allow communities to dream and improve. And to do that, we need brilliant librarians and we need brilliant libraries to make it happen. Thank you very much. All right. Questions, comments, what did I get wrong? Anyone want a mint?